Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you are fascinated by the darker, grittier side of history that textbooks often leave out, you are in the right place. Before we descend into the mud and blood of the medieval battlefield today, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light. Now, let's travel back in time. When we think of the medieval English longbowman, we usually picture a hero. We see Robin Hood, standing tall in the green forests of Sherwood, drawing his bow with effortless grace. We see a Hollywood actor, lean and handsome, firing arrows with the speed of a machine gun, untouched by the brutal reality of his weapon. We think of them as soldiers holding a piece of wood. But we are wrong. The truth is far more disturbing, and it was hidden under the ocean for nearly 500 years. To understand the reality of the longbowman, we don't look at paintings and we don't read poems. We look at the bones. The story begins in 1545 in the Solent Strait, just off the coast of the Isle of Wight. King Henry VIII is watching from the shore as his flagship, the Mary Rose, engages the French invasion fleet. It is a massive vessel, the pride of the Tudor Navy. But then, disaster strikes. A gust of wind, a mishandling of the gun ports, and the great ship heels over. Water rushes in. Within minutes, the Mary Rose sinks to the bottom of the sea, taking hundreds of men down with her. They were trapped in the dark, under the silt, encased in an oxygen-free tomb that preserved them in terrifying detail. Fast forward to 1982. The hull of the Mary Rose is raised from the depths in one of the most complex maritime archaeology projects in history. But the real treasure wasn't the gold or the cannons. It was the crew. Archaeologists recovered the remains of nearly 200 men, and as osteologists, bone specialists, began to examine the skeletons, they noticed something strange. Something consistent. Something that looked like a deformity or a disease, but it wasn't. Many of these skeletons showed a bizarre asymmetry. Their bodies were twisted. The bones in their left arms were enlarged, significantly thicker and denser than their right arms. Their shoulders were warped. Their spines showed signs of twisting scoliosis. These men weren't born this way. They had been made this way. They were the elite archers of the king, and their weapon, the English warbow, had literally reshaped their skeletons while they were still alive. This brings us to the core of our journey today, the longbow itself. To understand why these men's bodies were deformed, you have to understand the monstrous nature of the weapon they wielded. Forget the bows you see in modern archery competitions. Those are precision instruments, equipped with pulleys and stabilizers, often with a draw weight of perhaps 40 or 50 pounds. Drawing them requires effort, yes, but it is manageable for an average athletic person. The medieval warbow was a different beast entirely. It was a simple stave of yew, about 6 feet long, but the physics behind it were terrifying. Based on the artifacts recovered from the Mary Rose, we now know that the draw weight of a combat longbow was immense. We are talking about a draw weight ranging from 100 to 180 pounds. Let that sink in for a moment. 180 pounds. That is roughly 80 kilograms. Imagine picking up an adult man or a heavy sack of concrete using only the fingers of one hand and the muscles of your back and shoulder. Now imagine doing that not once, but 6 to 12 times a minute for hours on end in the heat of battle. This was not a weapon you could simply pick up and learn. If you handed a 150-pound warbow to a modern bodybuilder today, someone with massive pectoral muscles and biceps, they likely couldn't even draw it halfway. Why? Because drawing a warbow isn't about arm strength. It's about skeletal alignment and deep back muscles that most modern humans never use to that capacity. And this is where the biology of the deformity begins. The English realized very early on that you cannot train a man to use this weapon in his 20s. By then, his bones have set. His growth plates have fused. If you force a grown man to draw a heavy war bow repeatedly, he will simply tear his muscles or dislocate his joints. The human body is not designed for that kind of asymmetrical load. So the English didn't train soldiers. They grew them. The training began in childhood, often as young as 7 years old. In medieval England, archery wasn't just a hobby. It was the law. Kings like Edward III and Henry V issued proclamations banning other sports like football or cockfighting, mandating that every able-bodied male practice at the butts, the archery ranges, every Sunday and holiday. Imagine a 7-year-old boy. His bones are soft, pliable, and still growing. He is handed a small bow, scaled to his size, but still heavy relative to his strength. He stands in a very specific stance, left side facing the target, left arm extended straight out, pushing the bow away, while the right arm hooks the string and pulls it back to the ear. This action creates a massive compression force on the body. The left arm, the bow arm, becomes a pillar. It has to withstand the collapsing force of the bow. The right arm and shoulder pull back, compressing the shoulder blades together. As the boy grows, the bow gets heavier. 10 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old. Every week, thousands of repetitions. Because the body is still developing, it adapts to this stress in a phenomenon known as Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law states that bone in a healthy person or animal will adapt to the loads under which it is placed. If loading on a particular bone increases, the bone will remodel itself over time to become stronger to resist that sort of loading. So, what happened to our young archer? The humerus, the upper arm bone, of his left arm began to thicken. The body, realizing that this left arm was under constant, massive compression, deposited more calcium and bone matrix. The bone didn't just get wider, it got denser. In the Mary Rose skeletons, the left humerus is often significantly larger than the right, a reversed asymmetry compared to what we see in modern tennis players. But it went deeper than the arm. The force of the bow has to go somewhere. It travels down the left arm and smashes into the shoulder joint. This caused a condition known as os acromiale. The acromion is a bony process on the shoulder blade, the scapula. In a normal human development, this bone fuses to the rest of the scapula as we grow up. But in these archers, the constant tugging and pulling of the deltoid muscles and the pressure of the bow prevented this fusion from completing properly. It created a sort of floating shelf of bone. It's a defect, structurally speaking, but for the archer, it might have allowed for a greater range of motion, or it was simply a battle scar etched into the skeleton itself. Then there is the spine. When you draw a heavy bow, you are not standing perfectly straight. You are leaning into the bow, twisting your torso to align your shoulders. Doing this repeatedly during the growth spurts of adolescence caused the vertebrae to twist. Many archers developed a specific rotation in their upper spine. They were literally twisted by their trade. If you could see a longbowman naked, stripped of his tunic, he would look frighteningly disproportionate. His left arm and shoulder would be hulking, covered in thick, ropey muscle, while his right side, though strong, would look normal by comparison. He would walk with a specialized posture. He was a biological machine, engineered by the state from childhood to act as a human artillery piece. But the deformation wasn't just about strength, it was about pain. We often romanticize the past, thinking people were tougher back then. Perhaps they were, but looking at the joints of these men, we see the evidence of chronic agony. The recovered vertebrae show signs of Schmorl's nodes. This happens when the cartilage of the spinal disc herniates into the vertebra itself. It is a sign of immense vertical compression on the spine. It means these men likely suffered from chronic back pain, sciatica, and stiff joints before they were even 30 years old. They sacrificed their bodies for the king's wars, paying for every arrow released with the cartilage of their own spines. And yet, this physical cost was necessary. Why? Because the longbow was the nuclear weapon of its age. To understand why a society would subject its male population to such rigorous, body-altering training, we have to look at what the longbow could actually do. There is a myth that medieval plate armor made a knight invincible. We see movies where swords bounce off steel breastplates, and it is true, plate armor was a technological marvel. It made the wearer immune to most sword cuts and light spears. But the war bow changed the equation. A heavy war arrow, often made of ash or oak, tipped with a hardened steel bodkin point, carried an immense amount of kinetic energy. When released from a 150-pound bow, that arrow wasn't just flying, it was punching. Modern tests have shown that at close range, a heavy war arrow could penetrate chainmail and the padded gambeson underneath with ease. Against high-quality plate armor, the results are mixed and heavily debated by historians. At long range, the arrow might glance off the curved steel of a breastplate. But the battlefield is not a laboratory. It is chaotic. The archers didn't aim for the thickest part of the armor. They rained arrows down in a storm. They aimed for the face, the armpits, the groin, the unprotected limbs of the horses. And this is key, the horse. The English Longbowman was a deformed specialist, but his primary target wasn't always the knight, it was the mount. A knight on the ground is dangerous, but a knight on a horse is a tank. If you kill the horse, you turn a tank into a slow, metal-clad infantryman stuck in the mud. The sheer volume of fire, thousands of arrows per minute, created a death zone that no cavalry charge could survive intact. The relationship between the archer and his bow was intimate. He had to care for it like a living thing. Yew wood is sensitive. If it gets too dry, it becomes brittle and can explode in your hands, sending splinters of wood into your eyes. If it gets too wet, it loses its cast, its springiness, and the arrows lose their power. The archer would carry his bow in a canvas or leather case to keep it dry. He would constantly check the string, made of hemp or flax, rubbing it with beeswax to waterproof it. In the cold, damp mornings of a campaign in France, his life depended on that piece of wood. But let's go back to the body. We talked about the bones, but what about the nerves? The draw of a heavy bow compresses the nerves in the fingers. The archers used a 3-finger draw, index, middle, and ring finger. The pressure of 150 pounds on those 3 fingertips is excruciating without protection. They didn't use the modern tabs we see today. They often just had callus or simple leather gloves. Over time, the nerves in those fingertips would be deadened. The bones in the fingers themselves would thicken and flatten under the pressure. It's a small detail, but it paints a picture of the tactile reality of their lives. A longbowman's hand was a claw, hardened and shaped by the string. This physiological specialization created a social divide. In medieval society, you are what you do. The knights, the aristocracy, they trained in swordsmanship and horsemanship, skills of grace, money, and power. The archers were commoners. They were yeomen. But because of their specialized bodies and their irreplaceable skill, they gained a strange new status. They were valuable. A knight could be ransomed if captured. An archer? An archer was dangerous. He was a weapon of mass destruction that could be replaced only after another 15 years of training. This is why, according to some historical accounts, though debated, enemy forces would sometimes cut off the fingers of captured archers. If you cut off the draw fingers, you disable the machine. You destroy the investment. The deformed body of the archer was his passport to a better life, but also a mark of his servitude. He ate better than the average peasant because the king needed him strong. He was exempt from certain taxes, but he was also owned by the bow. He could not stop training. If he stopped, his muscles would atrophy, but the bone deformations would remain, leaving him a crippled, twisted old man. As we visualize this, we must strip away the romance. Picture a man standing in a muddy field in France. It is 1415. He is cold. He has dysentery, which was rampant in the camps. His gut is twisting in pain. He is hungry. But when the trumpet sounds, he stands up. He plants his feet in the mud. He picks up that 6-foot piece of yew. He engages the muscles of his back, the muscles that have been growing for this moment since he was 7 years old. His spine twists. His left arm locks out like a bar of iron. He feels the immense weight of the draw, a weight that would crush a normal man. He anchors the string to his ear. He looks down the shaft at the wall of French steel advancing towards him. He is not just a soldier. He is the culmination of a biological experiment. He is a weapon made of flesh and bone. And as he releases that arrow, the shock wave travels through his skeleton, vibrating through his teeth, his skull, his spine. He reaches for another arrow, and another. This was the mechanism of the English war machine. But how did this machine function when thousands of them were gathered together? How did the physics of the volley work to shatter the finest armies of Europe? To understand that, we have to move from the individual skeleton to the collective organism of the army. We have to look at the arrow storm. In the next part of this series, we will leave the anatomy lab and step onto the battlefield of Crécy and Poitiers. We will analyze the physics of the arrow itself, the terrifying sound it made, and the psychological horror of facing a cloud of death that blotted out the sun. We will discuss the tactical formation that utilized these deformed men to their maximum potential. Now that we have examined the twisted bones of the archer, we must turn our attention to the instrument of his destruction. To understand the true horror of the medieval battlefield, we cannot simply look at the man. We must look at the missile. We must analyze the physics of the arrow itself. When we see arrows in movies, they are often portrayed as light, almost weightless sticks that zip through the air. This is a complete fabrication. The war arrow of the English longbowman was closer to a javelin than it was to a modern sporting arrow. It was a heavy, brutal projectile designed for one purpose: to transfer massive amounts of kinetic energy into a human body. Let's break down the anatomy of this ammunition. The shaft was not just a stick found in the woods. It was carefully selected ash, birch, or oak. Ash was heavy and strong, used for armor-piercing shots at shorter ranges. Aspen or poplar was lighter, used for flight arrows intended to cover nearly 300 yards. These shafts were thick, sometimes half an inch in diameter near the head, tapering down towards the nock to improve aerodynamics. This design, known as barreled or bobtailed, was sophisticated engineering. It shifted the center of gravity forward, ensuring that when the arrow hit, it hit with maximum mass behind the point. But the real magic, and the real terror, happens the moment the string is released. This is a phenomenon known as the archer's paradox. When a longbowman releases that 150-pound draw, the immense force doesn't just push the arrow forward, it actually bends it. If you watch slow-motion footage of a war bow being fired, the arrow ripples like a snake. It bends around the handle of the bow, oscillates in the air, and then straightens out as it flies. This oscillation is critical. If the arrow is too stiff, it flies left. If it is too weak, it flies right, or worse, it shatters into splinters the moment the string hits it, driving jagged wood into the archer's own hand. The medieval Fletcher had to match the spine, the stiffness, of every single arrow to the weight of the bow. It was a mathematical relationship between wood and muscle. And then there is the arrival. Imagine standing on the receiving end. You are a French man-at-arms. You hear the sound first. It is not a whistle. It is a low, thrumming vibration, followed by the terrifying hiss of thousands of goose-feather fletchings cutting the air. This sound was psychological warfare. It was the sound of a storm that you could not outrun. When the arrow strikes, the physics of the impact are devastating. We are talking about an impact energy of roughly 100 to 120 joules. To put that in perspective, that is comparable to being shot by a modern .38 caliber pistol. But unlike a bullet, which is small and fast, the arrow is heavy and long. It carries momentum. A bullet might hit a piece of armor and shatter or flatten. An arrow flexes. It pushes. It drives. When a heavy bodkin point, that square-tapered steel spike, hits chainmail, it doesn't cut. It acts as a wedge. It effectively opens the door by bursting the rivets of the metal rings, allowing the thick wood shaft to follow it through. And the damage to the human body was catastrophic. We have records of arrows penetrating the thigh, passing through the saddle, and killing the horse underneath. We have accounts of men being pinned together. But the most gruesome reality of the arrow wound was not the penetration. It was the extraction. This brings us to the darkest chapter of the longbow's legacy, the medical nightmare. In the 15th century, germ theory did not exist. There were no antibiotics. There was no sterile environment. The battlefield was a soup of mud, feces, and blood. Every arrow tip was, by definition, a biological weapon. Even if the archer didn't intentionally poison it, the tip had been stuck in the dirt. It had been handled by dirty hands. It was covered in rust and oil. When an arrow entered the body, it carried with it bits of dirty clothing and chainmail into the deep tissue. This created the perfect environment for Clostridium perfringens, the bacteria that causes gas gangrene. If you were hit in a limb, you were lucky. They could chop it off. If you were hit in the torso, you were likely a dead man walking. But what if you were a high-ranking noble? What if you were the Prince of Wales? We must look at the specific case of Prince Hal, the future Henry V, at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. This story is the perfect case study for the horror of arrow wounds. The prince was 16 years old. During the battle, an arrow struck him in the face. It entered his left cheek, narrowly missing his eye, and buried itself deep in the bone at the back of his skull. The wooden shaft snapped off. The metal arrowhead remained lodged deep inside his head, surrounded by bone and brain matter. In most cases, this was a death sentence. But Hal was the heir to the throne. The king called for the greatest surgeon in England, a man named John Bradmore. Bradmore arrived and assessed the situation. He couldn't cut the prince's head open. The trauma would kill him. He couldn't pull the metal out. There was nothing to grab. So, Bradmore did something incredible. He invented a tool. He designed the Bradmore screw. It was a pair of hollow tongs, thin enough to slide into the narrow wound channel in the prince's cheek. Inside the tongs was a threaded screw mechanism. The procedure was excruciating. Remember, there is no anesthesia. They might have given the prince wine or perhaps a dwale, a dangerous herbal potion containing hemlock, opium, and henbane, but he would have been awake. Bradmore had to dilate the wound. He pushed dried elder pith, which expands when wet, into the hole in the prince's face to widen it day by day. Once the channel was wide enough, he inserted his metal instrument. He had to feel around blindly, inside the prince's skull, until he felt the metal socket of the arrowhead. He then inserted the screw into the socket, turned it to lock it in place, expanded the tongs, and pulled. Imagine the sound of metal scraping against bone inside your own head. Imagine the pressure. Bradmore succeeded. He extracted the arrowhead. He then washed the wound with white wine and honey, an antiseptic mixture that was centuries ahead of its time. The prince survived, but he bore a horrific scar for the rest of his life. This is the reality of the longbow. It wasn't just a clean kill. It was a generator of medical trauma that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. But let's step back from the individual and look at the collective. How do you deploy 5,000 of these biological machines effectively? You don't just line them up and say, shoot. You need geometry. The English developed a formation known as the Hertz. Historians still debate the exact shape. Some say it was a harrow shape, others say it was a checkerboard pattern. But the principle was simple: crossfire. If archers stand in a straight line, they can only shoot forward. But if you arrange them in wedges that protrude from the main battle line, they can shoot into the flanks of the approaching enemy. This created a kill box. As the French cavalry charged, they weren't just hit from the front, they were hit from the sides. This is crucial because horses have armor on their heads and chests, but their sides are vulnerable. When a horse is hit in the flank, it swerves, it panics, it crashes into the horse next to it. The Herse formation used the geometry of the battlefield to turn an orderly cavalry charge into a chaotic traffic jam of death. And protecting these archers was the stake. We mentioned the stakes briefly, but their engineering deserves more attention. These weren't just random sticks. Each archer carried a 6-foot stake of hardwood, sharpened at both ends. Why both ends? So that if the cavalry flanked them, they could pull the stake up and replant it in the other direction instantly. They planted these stakes at a specific angle, roughly 45 degrees, facing the enemy. The height was calculated perfectly. It was set at the height of a horse's breast. If a horse charged into it, the stake would pierce the chest, and the momentum of the animal would drive it deep into the heart, impaling the beast instantly. The archer didn't hide behind a wall. He stood amongst a forest of spikes. He was the bait in a deadly trap. But there is a limitation to the longbow that we must address: ammunition. A modern soldier carries perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition. A medieval archer carried a sheaf of 24 arrows tucked into his belt or linen bag. That's it. 24 arrows. If he is firing 10 arrows a minute, he is out of ammo in 2.5 minutes. 2.5 minutes. That is the duration of the entire arrow storm. So, how did battles last for hours? The answer lies in the runners. Behind the lines of archers, there were young boys, pages, and servants whose sole job was to run back and forth from the supply wagons. The wagons were parked in the rear, loaded with barrels of arrows. These boys would sprint through the mud, dodging stray crossbow bolts, carrying armfuls of fresh sheaves to the archers. It was a bucket brigade of death. If the supply chain broke, the army died. If the boys couldn't get the arrows to the front fast enough, the fire rate dropped, and the French cavalry would break through. The rhythm of the battle was dictated by the flow of these wooden shafts. This leads us to the industrial scale of the English war machine. We often think of medieval production as small-scale craft, but the English longbow required a global supply chain that rivals modern logistics. Let's talk about the feathers. You cannot use just any feather for a war arrow. Chicken feathers are too soft. They flap in the wind. You need goose feathers. And not just any goose feather. You need the feathers from the wing, specifically the primary flight feathers. And here is the kicker. You can only use feathers from the same side of the bird for a single arrow. If you mix left-wing feathers and right-wing feathers, the arrow will spin erratically and miss the target. Each arrow needed 3 feathers. England needed millions of arrows. Do the math. We are talking about millions of geese. The crown had to step in. A royal decree was issued. The goose feather tax. Every sheriff in every county was given a quota. They had to confiscate feathers. Plucking geese became a matter of national security. It sounds absurd to us now, but in 1415, a shortage of goose feathers was as serious as a shortage of oil or microchips is today. And then the wood. The best wood for the bow itself is yew, Taxus baccata. Yew is a magical wood because it has 2 layers. The white sapwood, which resists tension, and the red heartwood, which resists compression. When you shape a bow from yew, you create a natural composite spring. But English yew is grown in a wet climate. It's too coarse, too open-grained. It's sluggish. The best yew grows in high altitudes, in hot, dry summers and cold winters. It grows slowly, making the grain incredibly tight and the wood incredibly snappy. Where does this wood grow? Spain and Italy. Here is the irony. To defeat the French, the English had to import wood from the Mediterranean. But the Spanish and Italians were Catholic. They didn't always want to trade with the English. So, the English played a masterful economic game. They passed a law regarding the wine trade. English merchants imported massive amounts of wine from the Mediterranean. The crown mandated that for every tun, cask, of wine imported, the merchant had to import a certain number of yew bow staves along with it. If you wanted to sell wine in London, you had to bring weapons for the king. This flooded England with high-quality Spanish and Italian yew. The weapon that killed French knights at Agincourt was likely made of wood grown in Spain, transported by a merchant who just wanted to sell wine, and shot by a peasant whose skeleton was deformed by English law. It was the first true military-industrial complex. But what about the mind of the man in the middle of this? We have spoken of his body, but we must touch upon the psychology of the archer. There is a coldness to archery. A swordsman looks his enemy in the eye. He feels the impact of the blade. It is a rage-filled, intimate violence. Archery is different. It is detached. You are killing a man you cannot see clearly. You are firing into a mass. You are a mechanic of death. But when the arrows run out and the melee begins, the psychology shifts instantly. At Agincourt, when the archers dropped their bows and drew their swords, they released a different kind of energy. It was the pent-up rage of the lower class. You have to remember the social structure. The knights on the other side were the landlords. They were the men who taxed the archers, who judged them, who owned the land the archers farmed. On the battlefield, the social order was suspended. A muddy, toothless, deformed archer with a lead mallet could crush the skull of a duke. And they did. They targeted the wealthy. There was a viciousness to the English archers that terrified the French. They didn't capture for ransom, at least not initially. They killed. They were efficient exterminators. We also have to consider the environment they lived in during a campaign, the camp life. An army of 6,000 archers creates a biological hazard. Without modern latrines, the camp quickly becomes a cesspool. We mentioned dysentery, but let's describe it. It is a disease of filth. It spreads through water. In the days leading up to Agincourt, the English were marching through scorched earth. The French had destroyed food supplies. The English were eating nuts, berries, and raw meat. They were drinking water from puddles. When we imagine the deformed archer, we shouldn't just picture the big bones. We should picture a man who is likely gaunt from malnutrition, his teeth loose from scurvy, his skin covered in lice, which carried typhus, and his bowels turning to water. And yet, he fights. This is the most remarkable part of the story. The sheer durability of these men. They were not the towering, steroid-filled action heroes of today. They were likely shorter than us, average height perhaps 5'7" or 5'8". But their bone density was off the charts. If you put a modern Navy SEAL in a wrestling match with a medieval longbowman, the SEAL might have better cardio and technique, but the longbowman would have the grip strength of a hydraulic press. Forensic archaeology on the fingers of these skeletons shows massive ridges where the tendons attached. Their hands were essentially claws. They could likely crush a raw potato in one hand. This strength was not built in a gym. It was built by survival. As we close this chapter on the physics and the horror of the mid-game, we have to look at the transition to the endgame. The longbow was at its peak. It had the perfect supply chain, the perfect biological training program, and the perfect tactical deployment. It seemed unstoppable. The French were terrified of it. They called the arrows the English devils. But history is cruel. Just as the longbow reached its zenith, the seeds of its destruction were being sown. Not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory. The smell of sulfur was beginning to drift across Europe. In the final part of our series, we will witness the tragedy of obsolescence. We will see how the biological machine was replaced by the chemical machine. We will watch the longbowman fade from history, not with a bang, but with a whimper, leaving behind only his bones to tell the tale. We will also explore the strange afterlife of the longbow, how it survived in secret societies, and how, in a strange twist of fate, it was actually used in combat as late as World War II. Yes, you heard that right. An English longbow in World War II. But first, we must survive Agincourt. We stand now at the precipice of the most famous moment in the history of the longbow. The date is October 25th, 1415. The place is a muddy field in northern France, near the castle of Agincourt. If you have seen Shakespeare's Henry V, you imagine a rousing speech, a band of brothers standing tall and proud. But the reality of Agincourt was not poetic. It was pathetic. The English army was a wreck. They had been marching for 2.5 weeks, covering 260 miles on barely any food. They were soaking wet, freezing cold, and, as we mentioned, ravaged by the bloody flux, dysentery. When the sun rose that morning, the 5,000 English archers looked across the field at the French army. The contrast was sickening. The French numbered anywhere from 20,000 to 30,000 men. They were the glittering armored elite of Europe, fed, rested, and confident. They were so sure of victory that they had allegedly already painted a cart to carry the captured King Henry back to Paris. But the French made a fatal error. They chose a battlefield that was too narrow. The field was flanked by dense woods on both sides. This meant they could not flank the English. They had to come straight at them. And the ground was a plowed field that had been soaked by torrential rain for a week. It was a quagmire of thick, sucking clay. The battle began with a gamble. King Henry V knew his men were starving. If they waited, they would die of hunger. So he ordered the archers to advance. This was unheard of. Archers are defensive troops. But these men, these skeletal deformities, pulled up their stakes, those 6-foot sharpened poles, and marched forward to within extreme bowshot range of the French, about 300 yards. They replanted their stakes in the mud, creating a new wall of spikes. Then, on a signal from Sir Thomas Erpingham, who threw his baton into the air, 5,000 men drew their bows. The first volley was not intended to kill. It was intended to annoy. It was a teasing volley. The heavy arrows rained down on the French knights, clattering against their armor. It was an insult. The French chivalry, enraged by these dirty peasants shooting at them, lost their discipline. They charged, and the trap snapped shut. As the French cavalry thundered forward, the mud grabbed them. Heavy war horses, carrying men in full plate armor, a combined weight of over 1,000 pounds, sank to their knees. The charge lost all momentum. It became a slow-motion struggle. Then, the biological machines unleashed the true storm. The English archers were firing at a rate of 10 to 12 arrows per minute. With 5,000 archers, that is 50,000 to 60,000 arrows every 60 seconds. The result was not a battle. It was an industrial accident. The horses, maddened by the pain of arrows striking their unarmored flanks and heads, panicked. They threw their riders into the mud. They turned back and crashed into the infantry advancing behind them. The French army became a crushed, chaotic mob. But the horror of Agincourt wasn't just the arrows. It was the suffocation. The French pressed forward so relentlessly, pushing from the back, that the men at the front were literally crushed to death by the weight of their own comrades. Historical accounts describe piles of the dead rising as high as a man's head. Knights fell into the mud and couldn't get up because of the weight of their armor and the press of bodies. They drowned in inches of liquid mud. They suffocated inside their own helmets. And then, the archers did the unthinkable. When the arrows ran out, the longbowmen didn't retreat. They attacked. You have to visualize this. Men who are sick, half-naked, armed only with knives, swords, and heavy lead mallets, charging into a mass of armored knights. But the knights were exhausted. They were stuck in the mud, trapped in the crush. The archers were light. They moved over the piles of dead bodies like cats. They used their immense upper body strength, the strength built by the bow, to swing those lead mallets. A strike from a lead maul doesn't need to penetrate armor. It caves in the helmet. It crushes the skull. The archers went from being artillery to being butchers. They slipped daggers through the visors of the fallen French. They worked with a terrifying efficiency. This was class warfare at its most brutal. The peasant was slaughtering the prince. By early afternoon, the battle was effectively over. But then, a dark shadow fell over the victory. A shadow that reveals the true nature of medieval war. King Henry V received a report that a French unit was attacking his baggage train in the rear, and he saw the remaining French forces regrouping for another charge. He had thousands of French prisoners, more prisoners than he had soldiers. He realized a terrifying possibility. If the prisoners realized the English were overwhelmed, they could pick up weapons from the ground and attack from the inside. So, Henry gave the order: kill the prisoners. This was a war crime, even by medieval standards. It violated the code of chivalry. You do not kill a captured knight, you ransom him. The English knights refused to do it. They wouldn't stain their honor. So, who did the king turn to? He turned to the archers. The archers had no code of chivalry. They were practical men. To them, a live French knight was just a threat. So, 200 archers were detailed to execute the prisoners. They went methodically through the captives, slitting throats, stabbing hearts, and crushing skulls. It was a cold-blooded massacre of defenseless men. This moment defines the English longbowman. He was not a knight in shining armor. He was a tool of the state, used for the dirty, difficult work of winning at all costs. Agincourt was the zenith. The longbow had defeated the greatest army in Europe. But it was also the beginning of the end. Within 100 years, the bow would be on its way out. Why? We return to the central thesis of our story: the biology versus the economy. As the 15th century turned into the 16th, the firearm began to mature. The early arquebus was heavy, slow, and inaccurate. But it had one massive advantage. It didn't require a deformed skeleton. Training a longbowman took 10 to 15 years. You had to feed him. You had to ensure he didn't die of plague. You had to rely on a culture of village sports. But England was changing. The enclosure acts were beginning. Landlords were fencing off the common lands to raise sheep for the wool trade. The village greens, where archers had practiced for centuries, were disappearing. The yeoman class, the independent farmers who made up the archery corps, was being forced off the land and into the cities. The culture that produced the biological machine was dying. You cannot have longbowmen without the lifestyle that creates them. On the other hand, a gun is a democratic weapon. It requires no strength. A starving, sickly man from the slums of London can pull a trigger just as effectively as a strong man. A gun takes 2 weeks to master. From the king's perspective, the math was simple. Option A. Spend 15 years and massive political capital trying to maintain a culture of archery to produce a limited number of elite troops. Option B. Buy 1,000 arquebuses from Italy, hire 1,000 random men, and have an army ready in a month. Quantity has a quality all its own. The gun didn't win because it was better. It won because it was scalable. The art of archery was replaced by the industry of gunpowder. The tragic end of the longbowman is best symbolized by the Mary Rose, the ship we started with. When she sank in 1545, she carried longbows and cannons side by side. It was a transition period. The men who died on that ship were the last generation of the true war archers. Their skeletons, twisted and thick, were the final evidence of a breeding program that was about to go extinct. In 1595, the Privy Council of England issued a decree. The longbow was officially reclassified. It was no longer a weapon of war, it was a sporting implement. The yew staves were put in storage to rot. The era of the biological machine was over. But history has a strange way of echoing. I want to leave you with one final, incredible story. A story that proves the spirit of the longbowman didn't die in 1595. Fast forward to World War II. 1940, France. The German blitzkrieg is sweeping across the continent. The British Expeditionary Force is retreating to Dunkirk. Among the British officers is a man named Jack Churchill. His nickname was Mad Jack. He was an eccentric. He believed that an officer should never go into battle without a sword. But he also carried something else: a massive 6-foot English longbow and a quiver of arrows. His fellow officers thought he was insane. But Jack was deadly serious. He had represented Britain in the World Archery Championships. In May 1940, near the village of L'Épinette, Jack Churchill led an ambush against a German patrol. He signaled the attack not by firing a gun, but by drawing his longbow. He loosed an arrow. It flew silently through the air and struck the German Feldwebel, sergeant, in the chest, killing him instantly. Think about that. In the middle of the 20th century, amidst machine guns, tanks, and airplanes, a German soldier was killed by a medieval longbow. It was the last recorded kill by an English longbow in warfare. A ghostly echo of Agincourt, ringing out 500 years later. So, what is the legacy of the English longbowmen? It is not just the battles they won. It is what they tell us about the human price of war. When we look at the skeletons from the Mary Rose, we see the ultimate sacrifice. These men gave more than their lives. They gave their bodies while they were still alive. They allowed the state to mold their very bones, to twist their spines, to deaden their nerves, all to become a better weapon. We often talk about the military-industrial complex, but the longbowman was part of a military-biological complex. He reminds us that throughout history, the most dangerous weapon has never been the sword, the gun, or the bomb. The most dangerous weapon is the human body, pushed to its absolute limit by discipline, pain, and the will to survive. Next time you see a statue of a knight, look past him. Look for the peasant standing in the background, holding a piece of yew. Look at his oversized shoulders. Look at his twisted back. He is the one who really won the wars. He is the one who shaped history with his own flesh and bone. Thank you for watching. If this deep dive into the osteology and history of the longbow has changed the way you see medieval warfare, please leave a like and share this video. It helps us navigate the algorithm and bring more filthy truths to light. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments. If you had to choose a weapon to master, the grace of the sword or the raw power of the longbow, which would you choose, knowing the physical cost? I'll be reading your answers. Stay curious, stay critical, and I will see you in the next video.